A slew of political news across the globe on this Monday morning. Let's start in Turkey, which is heading for a runoff vote in an election that could end over 2 decades of power for the current president, Recep Erdogan. Preliminary results showing the incumbent with a lead of more than 2 million, but that is not enough to avoid a second round. That's scheduled for May 28th. Meanwhile, in Thailand, the country's pro-democracy parties gained a victory in the parliamentary vote. It's a big challenge to the royalist-backed establishment that's been in power since the military seized power in a coup almost a decade ago. And finally, the G7 summit kicks off in Japan later this week, with the U.S. and its allies expected to put more pressure on China. The Wall Street Journal reporting the countries will issue a joint statement rejecting the use of an economic retaliation against nations over policy disputes and other disagreements. So, a lot going on. How should investors play the global picture? How should they be viewing the prospects for global growth? Let's bring in Brendan McKenna. He's Wells Fargo international economist. So obviously a lot to piece through here with these different events going on. I guess we can start with the G7 first, because that probably has the biggest global impact here. What are you expecting, particularly as regards policy with China, and then how the sort of read through to global growth?
Yeah, I think the message from the G7 meeting is going to be pretty consistent from what we've seen over the last couple of years, in the sense that there's going to be this coordinated approach to kind of contain China from an economic perspective, also maybe from a geopolitical perspective as well. And I think that, again, that's been a pretty consistent message, at least since the Biden administration took over a few years ago. And we've also seen some pretty consistent messaging from the rest of the G7 on that front as well. So I would expect some type of communique or some type of message that, again, just reinforces that point of containing China, again, from an economic and a geopolitical standpoint.
Where do you think there might be overlap in the talks among all of these countries with regard to their own interest rate policy that they've enacted separately and in some cases in kind of tandem in order to combat inflation in their respective nations?
Yeah, I think maybe a theme will be that inflation is a problem. Tight monetary policy is something that needs to persist for the time being. But I think when you're thinking about monetary policy from each of these central banks, again, maybe they're coordinated, but they're not necessarily saying we're going to raise interest rates in tandem with you. We're going to conduct our own independent review of monetary policy and inflation, and we'll adjust interest rates accordingly. As domestic economic conditions evolve. So there may be a theme there, and there may be some coordination, but I don't think each central bank is assessing monetary policy in tandem with other central banks.
Well, and then there's one that's been an outlier for a little while, and that's the Turkish central bank, right, which has sort of adopted a very unorthodox policy under President Erdogan, really his influence of cutting rates to combat inflation, which is unlike pretty much every other central bank around the world. As you look at the Turkish situation, is there now potentially a road to reversing that? Or I don't know how much you guys are gaming out the political chances of him to survive this runoff vote.
So we're certainly gaming out the chances of Erdogan surviving the vote. And I would say after the first round, there's probably a higher percentage chance that Erdogan actually retains office. And some of these unorthodox monetary policies that you mentioned, those are probably going to be in place for the longer term. So if you're thinking about a reversal or a reversion back to orthodox monetary theory in Turkey, I don't think that's something that's imminent, and I don't think that's something that's going to be a result of the presidential and parliamentary elections that we're going through right now.
Do you see any kind of improvement in the economic situation overall in Turkey?
Unfortunately, no. I think if you have a policy direction that's led by unorthodox monetary theory, that unfortunately leads to currency crisis, above target inflation, in some cases hyperinflation, and all of that just has negative compounding economic effects going forward. So I think this kind of muddle through situation with, again, economic deterioration that Turkey has been going through for years now is something that's likely to persist, assuming that Erdogan retains office and kind of leads the direction on overarching monetary and economic policy in Turkey.
And then switching on over to some of the other emerging markets we're watching, there was the Thai election as well. There's also Argentina trying to bolster its currency. So as investors are looking at the sort of idiosyncratic individual situations around the world, where are you seeing potentially most opportunity for economic growth upside?
As far as economic growth upside, I think a lot of the upside is probably going to be captured in Asia. We've seen China reopen. We have some pretty encouraging Q1 data. Some of the economic rebound may be starting to mature, but I think you're still looking at a scenario where China grows 6% this year. And that's a relatively strong growth rate. On the same side, I think India is also an economy that's probably positioned for economic growth upside as well. So you might be looking at an Indian economy that grows somewhere in the 6% range as well. That's a growth rate that hasn't been achieved in India for some years now. So I think when you're thinking about the majority of where global growth is going to come from, it's going to come from China, India, Indonesia, and most of emerging in Southeast Asia.
And is the emerging in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, is that also because of the relationship with China, or are there other nations that people should think about as well that are really intertwined with that market?
I think the China reopening is certainly playing into the economic upside across the region, but I think there are some other idiosyncratic stories that are, somewhat positive for some of these emerging Asian economies. In India, we had multiple shocks starting with COVID, the war in Ukraine pushing up commodity prices. It looks like all of those effects are going to ease going forward. Then we also just have some other success stories in EM Asia, like Vietnam, Taiwan, Thailand, where these countries have become more integrated into the global supply chain, and we're still slowly starting to see the benefits of those developments now. So I think those are somewhat idiosyncratic and country-specific developments that, again, can lead to positive upward surprises on the economic growth front.
Thanks a lot, Brendan. We don't talk a lot about international economies, but it's important for U.S. investors to know there's other places that they can put their money, not just in the U.S. Brendan McKenna, Wells Fargo international economist. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.